person who did this is someone's friend, neighbor, coworker, or relative. We are asking anyone who may have heard someone speak about the marathon or the date of April 15th in any way that indicated that he or she may target the event to call us. Someone knows who did this.
And someone probably does know who did this. The hope is that he or she will turn in the Boston bomber. Joining me are Mark Potok of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Robert Baer, CNN contributor and former CIA operative, and CNN national security analyst Fran Townsend. Welcome to you all. Let's start from the premise that none of us know the answer to what we're about to discuss. But what I do want to do is explore the theories, because Mark Potok, you're an expert in domestic extremism. Bob Baer, an expert in foreign extremism, and Fran Townsend, obviously an expert in national security. Between the three of you, I'm hoping we can at least get to a position of some clarity as to where we may be heading here with the investigation. Let me start with you, Mark Potok. From everything that you've seen and read, do you see real signs that this is more likely to be some form of domestic extremist attack?
Well, honestly, Pierce, I'm not sure that we know that. There are some indicators that suggest it's conceivable that it was related to, in particular, this thing, Patriots' Day. Patriots' Day is actually on April 19th. It's this Friday, but in Massachusetts, it's celebrated on Monday. It celebrates, of course, the American Revolutionary War, the first shots fired at Concord and Lexington. But in the world I cover, it is really known for being the opening of the Revolutionary War, the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, a big raid in 1985 of a white supremacist compound in Arkansas, and then probably most importantly, the end of the debacle in Waco, where 80 people died in a fire, and 2 years later, payback for the events in Waco, the bombing of the Oklahoma City building in '95. So, that day is kind of an iconic date on the calendar. However, I've got to say, the date that is important to these people is not the third Monday in April, as is celebrated in Massachusetts, but the actual date of April 19th.
Bob Baer, you've done many covert operations for CIA. From what you've seen and read, where is your head going with this?
Well, there are a couple observations I have, Pierce, and one is the fact that there were two explosive devices used. They went off fairly reliably. That's not easy to do. I've made these improvised devices myself. I've watched instructors do it. It's difficult. The timing devices, inevitably one doesn't go off, or there's a low order of explosives. So somebody knew what they were doing, at least had some practice. Two is the
Bob,
fact that
I don't know, Bob, if you can see these pictures, but we're actually showing new images of what the police and FBI believe are the devices, or part of the devices that may have been used here. It's Atlanta station WAGA. Can you see these pictures, Bob?
No, I can't see them. But I know it's a pressure cooker.
Right.
And pressure cookers are commonly used in the Middle East. In fact, in the 80s, the CIA trained the Afghans to use small stoves or pressure cookers against the Soviet Red Army. But that doesn't mean anything. You can, you can get on the internet and look this stuff up. The timers, you can look it up. If a cell phone was used, you can look that up and see how to do it. But the point is the actual practice. I really do believe somebody knew what they were doing on this. But number two, I'd like to say, is that the fact that nobody's claimed it tells me it isn't Al-Qaeda. This would be a huge breakthrough to them, and they would say something at this point, make further threats. It's just in their MO, and they haven't done it so far. So if I were forced to make a vote, I'd say it was domestic.
Fran Townsend, that is the way that a lot of people are beginning to think. But of course, we have to keep reminding everyone, nobody knows. What do you make of the way the investigation is unfurling here?
Piers, what I would say is actually I think the answer is something a little bit in the middle of your Bob Baer and Mark, what they're saying to you. I think what we're most likely seeing is a domestic, a homegrown sort of lone wolf, or, a small group who are inspired by jihadists. It's on these jihadi websites, the Inspire magazine, that's the Al-Qaeda publication, where you find a lot of the information Bob was talking about in terms of building these kinds of devices and targeting large groups and multiple simultaneous attacks like we saw at the finish of the Boston Marathon. And so it may be, as we say, a little bit of both, right? It may be a domestic incident in the sense that it's homegrown, but it may be its link may be its inspiration, sort of like the Nidal Hassan, who was the Fort Hood shooter.
Right. I mean, Mark Potok, if it is a domestic terror attack, is it more likely, from your experience, to be a lone wolf or part of an existing group?
Well, I think in general it's more likely to be a lone wolf. These kinds of things, at least in the radical right, the non-Islamic radical right, they don't tend to be carried out in groups at all. I've got to say, I think there's something to what was just said, that it may be, in fact, a homegrown radical, but perhaps of the jihadist sort. And the reason I think about that in that way is think about who the targets were. You know, this was not a target that one would associate with a radical right-wing bomber. It was not a government building. It was not the IRS, although it was tax day on Monday. It was not a minority group. It wasn't black people or Jewish people or gay people or Muslims. In fact, the only thing really that the victims, that the targets shared in common, it seems to me, is they were Americans. So that does suggest a broader kind of attack, and perhaps one that's not linked to the world that we cover.
And Bob Baer, of course, one of the 3 dead has been identified now as a Chinese citizen. So this is not just an attack on America and Americans, but a global attack in that sense. What would be the repercussions if, for argument's sake, it does turn out to be some form of al-Qaeda related attack in terms of the impact on countries like China who've been affected?
Well, I mean, the Chinese have been the victims of al-Qaeda in the Uyghur part of the country. And if you take the tack that it was al-Qaeda, remember that all they care about is causing mass casualties, as many as they can. They do believe that that will stop occupation of the Middle East. And while we're more guilty than the Chinese are nonetheless guilty of oppressing Muslims. And, you know, if it were a radical Islamic group, it's not going to matter to them. The point is to attack the West until it picks up and leaves the Middle East. And this ideology you can also pick up on the internet, and it can be turned against us at any moment. And remember, there is no playbook for al-Qaeda. A lot of these bombings in London, the airplane bombings, it was young kids who just decided that's what they were going to do. So, you know, to go back on what I said about no claim, well, there is, you know, there is no set standard for an attack like this. And we're really not going to know until they get the forensics, until they get a picture. You know, we're so far away from a solution on this.
Yeah, we are, and just keep stressing that nobody knows the answer to these questions. It's pure theorizing, but it is, of course, what everyone in America is talking about. Fran, finally and quickly, does the fact that al-Qaeda haven't claimed any responsibility, or none of their affiliate groups claim responsibility, is that significant? Or I think from memory, they have in the past sometimes waited several months before doing that, so that may not be particularly relevant.
That's right, Piers. I mean, sometimes they wait. They'll release a sort of martyr, what they call a martyr's video. That is someone who is responsible or killed in the attack, pre-tapes a video that they release much later, or it's more difficult for them to communicate. So Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, might release a video many months later when he can get it out, claiming responsibility. I think Bob's right. Typically, if it's al-Qaeda related, you'd see a claim of responsibility, but to your point, it may take some time.
Well, thank you all very much, Mark Potok, Bob Baer and Fran Townsend. Thank you. Coming up, the scene of the horror. I'll talk to eyewitnesses to the bombing and a hero who raced to save the victims.